Hi everyone, this is Peter, and in this short lecture I want to talk a little bit about 20th century architecture and design, primarily focusing really on architecture, and especially on architecture between about, 1915, 20 or so, up into maybe 1940 and the beginning of World War II. The most important thing to think about in this particular theme is a radical transformation of architecture away from the kinds of period revivals that were very common in the 19th century. This is exemplified, among other things, by the very Gothic House of Commons in London, to take an example. There are a number of revivals of this sort. The most obvious one is classical revival, sort of neoclassical buildings that are very, very popular toward the end of the 18th century. We see Gothic revival. I just mentioned the Houses of Parliament. Later on in the century, we see perhaps a little bit more obscure in terms of an architectural style, the Romanesque revival. And then there are all kinds of interminglings and mixtures of those. As we exit the 19th century and go into the 20th, there's a greater and greater impatience with the principles of constant revivals. One of the most important ones, and a kind of modernist, I think, idea, is that for a modern era to constantly be referring to the architectural vernacular of long gone eras of the past, again, Romanesque, Gothic, being, roughly around the year 1100, 1300. That seems inappropriate to a modern culture. And by modern culture, I'm talking about what's developing in Western Europe and America. So what we start seeing is calls for reform in terms of design. This is happening, by the way, also in the design and manufacture of many of the objects that mass production has put into place. So it could go anywhere from furniture, it could be clothing, it could be, something as utilitarian as a pair of scissors, or as we'll see as we move into the 20th century, objects or tools like cars, and so on. So the call for a transformation of the ideas and processes of design is very much underway by the time we come into the end of the 19th century. And this has manifested itself in the very well-known arts and crafts movement in Art Nouveau, trying to find a contemporary vernacular that's rooted in its own era, not dependent upon the precedents of the past, and designed to serve the purposes of the present. So what does that mean in terms of actual effects? Well, a couple of important architects to take into account in this transformation of architecture. The first one whose building is on the left, the Marshall Field Wholesale Store in Chicago, is Henry Hobson Richardson. And while this does in fact refer to, and it's probably not a bad example of, Romanesque revival with the round arches and the stone facing, and really not in the kind of mid-20th century sense of the term a true skyscraper, it certainly begins to reject or abandon many of the conventional building designs and procedures, sort of architectural principles that would have dominated the buildings of the past, basically. A good place to look, by the way, for changes by the end of the 19th century would have been something like the Eiffel Tower, or perhaps a little bit earlier, the famous Crystal Palace of 1851. The Crystal Palace made primarily of cast iron and glass, and the Eiffel Tower, again, an all-metal building. Another important architect, as we come into the late 19th century, is going to be Louis Sullivan. And in this particular building, the Prudential Building, definitely we see the roots of the modern skyscraper. And particularly, we're going to see the integration. This is really quite important. as we go forward, the integration of steel into the building process. And the importance of that is that steel as a support material in its own right allows kind of a dispensing with structurally important sheathing. So basically what we're going to start drifting toward is basically a steel framework, and that steel framework is clad in exterior almost entirely of glass, and that's the kind of paradigm of the contemporary American skyscraper. So Richardson and Sullivan are definitely setting this sort of trend toward buildings that rely less on older architectural styles. They basically focus increasingly, and it's the famous statement of Louis Sullivan that form follows function, that the primary purpose of a building really should be the factor that dictates its appearance. It's pretty important stuff. Now, let's move forward then just a couple decades or so into the designs that characterize our next important art movement. So when we look at design as we move into the 1920s and 30s, two movements in particular are very, very important. One of them is known as de Stijl, basically Dutch for the style. So what does this mean? Well, in essence, what we're looking for in design is a radical simplification, simplification forms an elimination of decoration. Even Louis Sullivan in his building goes to considerable lengths to cover his relatively stark and geometric overall plan with copious amounts of subtle and understated but nevertheless present decoration. In this particular structure, where we're looking at basically domestic architecture, which is interesting in its own right, by Gerrit Rietveld, the Schroeder House in Utrecht, 1924. This is in many ways, a thoroughly up-to-date architectural looking building. It is or wouldn't be out of place at all in any number of locations in America or Europe. It's, again, radically simplified. The exterior forms here are defined primarily in terms of flat, rectangular planes. There's no extraneous ornament, either two-dimensional in terms of mural decoration or relief patterns or sculpture of any kind. It's really nothing quite like this. It's hard for us. We're so used to this style of art that we really don't see just how radically different it is. The purity of form, the simplicity of color is reminiscent of the painting style of one of the other members of de Stijl, and that, of course, is the very famous abstract painter Piet Mondrian. And it's really, in many ways, a kind of three-dimensional translation of Mondrian painting into a house that is very, best way of putting this is relatively flexible. For instance, the second floor has partitions, a kind of echo of the now infamous office cubicle, that we can shift and rearrange the division of the room as we go in a kind of flexible and updatable fashion. Probably the most influential movement in terms of 20th century, especially pre-war 20th century design architecture, is going to be found in the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus really comes into its own really about 100 years or so from now, 2019. In 1919, when the director Walter Gropius becomes the director. And the Bauhaus, in essence, is going back really to the beginning of the beginning of the 20th century. It's founded in 1906. It's intended to be a design school, again, artists, architects, designers in general, to basically provide a kind of infrastructure, as it were, for modernism. So again, coming back to these themes that we touched on just briefly with the Sullivan and with the Richardson, and also to some extent with the Rietveld House, to provide the kinds of ideas that would be effective in supporting this new way of living, of working, of governing. And again, they were hugely influential. If we look, for instance, at the picture of the shop block from 1925-26, and sadly, these dates are going to run right into the rise of Nazi Germany with considerably negative consequences for the Bauhaus. But if we look again at a building from 1926, it would not at all be out of place in a contemporary American or European office park. It looks exactly like it would fit in. The reliance on clean, open floor plans, geometrical forms, the sense of flexibility that you could put one kind of factory in here 1 month and then clear it all out and put another one in, or in the case of the contemporary age, a Google or a Twitter or something like this. This is remarkably, fulfilling of the ideas of modernism, to make effective, functional, simple, cost-effective structures for the use of a modern culture. Another very important architect coming out of the Bauhaus is Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, or van der Rohe, I should say. And if you look at his 1922 model, again for a skyscraper, this is quite extraordinary, and yet, again, extraordinarily contemporary. As you can see, this takes that idea that I just mentioned of a steel skeleton, a framework. Again, steel with, and as you can see in the Farnsworth house to the right, and this shows up elsewhere. Corbusier's Villa Savoye does the same thing. If you mix steel with concrete, you can, in essence, pretty much build whatever you want, certainly in terms of height. The skyscraper relies almost exclusively on the tensile strength of steel. His skyscraper is extraordinarily graceful, elegant, and powerful architectural statement. And in today's world, skyscrapers are still, in essence, tall vertical buildings, the sort of currency of the realm in large urban areas even today. Mies van der Rohe's domestic architecture is quite interesting as well. The Farnsworth house with this very elegant, simple, restrained, and yet very functional. That is, of course, as long as you have enough curtains for privacy. His domestic architecture reflects many of the same priorities. And the last personality of this new era in architectural design is an individual known as Le Corbusier, or Corbusier. And is, in this particular case, he's very, very interested in the problems of domestic architecture. Again, the idea of a machine for living. That's a very modernist concept, that we need machines, and the machines are going to provide this kind of support. Anyway, in his Villa Savoye, it's I don't think we could say necessarily this would be applicable to the vast majority of people. And that is a concern, by the way, for these modernist architects, how to provide urban housing. But on the whole, it provides a very interesting and effective template, perhaps on a reduced scale or reduced sophistication in terms of its features. A very good template for suburban, that's going to be increasingly a thing as we go through this period, for suburban dwellings, that you can create efficient, effective, streamlined, easy to construct. For instance, prefabrication is going to become a thing, obviously. Open, airy types of space for domestic purposes. So to sum up, this period is one of radical transformation, and yet in our own time, when we look at these, they have a strikingly contemporary feel, precisely because we share with modernist architects and designers this obsession with clarity, simplicity, the kind of an austere aesthetic. And again, to take another equivalent of design, we might consider the design aesthetic of somebody like Steve Jobs when he was working for Apple in the late 20th century, a legacy that continues to this time.